Logic is apparently not the strong suit of the apologist, as I keep seeing these kinds of claims made by the religiously credulous, things that anyone with the slightest grounding in logic and reason would look at and laugh. Of course, they're not trying to propose credible arguments. They're playing to the already convinced, trying desperately to make their beliefs look reasonable, even though they're not. So this week, I take a look at a video by the Christian activist claiming proof of God, where, as we will soon see, there is anything but. So let's dive into this admittedly well-animated but intellectually vapid video and see what's what.
We live in an amazing universe. Have you ever wondered why it exists? Why does anything at all exist?
And that right there begins the problem. Now, philosophically, you can certainly ask that question, but it's a question inherently without a rational answer. Why is not a rational question? Because it assumes a purpose. There may be no reason. Why does one person get hit by lightning and someone standing 5 feet away does not? There's no purpose to this event. You can answer how it happens, you can examine the circumstances around it, but you can never explain that the person hit was a bad person who beat their children, and therefore the lightning purposely chose to strike them. So, while you're going to find why in philosophy a lot, philosophy really doesn't describe reality very well. You can ask yourself why a unicorn can only be ridden by a virgin, at least as the old tales go, but that doesn't actually demonstrate that unicorns exist.
Gottfried Leibniz wrote, "The first question which should rightly be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing?" He came to the conclusion that the explanation is found in God. But is this reasonable? Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence.
And this is where we go entirely off the logical deep end, so we'll take this one step at a time. Now, it depends on what you mean by explanation. Do you mean cause, or do you mean purpose? We can explain rationally where things came from. We cannot explain rationally why they came into existence, and this is a very important distinction to make, as we shall see.
If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God.
And that's just pulled straight out of his ass. You could just as well say that the explanation is leprechauns. God has not been demonstrated to exist, therefore God cannot be an explanation for anything.
The universe exists.
Indeed it does, at least to the best of our ability to test it. But again, looking for purpose is not a rational question to ask.
From these, it follows logically that the explanation of the universe's existence is God.
And that is entirely circular. Premise 2 is a bald assertion. The conclusion just repeats that bald assertion. Nowhere has said premise been validated. Logic, people! Learn some! But I guess to his credit, our activist does go on to examine these premises. So let's see where he goes entirely wrong.
The logic of this argument is airtight. If the three premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. But are they more plausibly true than false? The third premise is undeniable for anyone seeking truth. But what about the first premise? Why not say, the universe is just there, and that's all? No explanation needed. End of discussion. Well, imagine you and a friend are hiking in the woods and come across a shiny sphere lying on the ground. You would, naturally, wonder how it came to be there. And you'd think it odd if your friend said, "There's no reason or explanation for it. Stop wondering. It just is." And if the ball were larger, it would still require an explanation. In fact, if the ball were the size of the universe, the change in its size wouldn't remove the need for an explanation. Indeed, curiosity about the existence of the universe seems scientific and intuitive.
But this just illustrates what I was saying. Say we do find a shiny sphere in the woods. We can find out where it came from. Can we find some purpose for it being there? No, we can't. There is no purpose in its existence. There is a cause. There is no reason.
Someone might say, if everything that exists needs an explanation, what about God? Doesn't he need an explanation? And if God doesn't need an explanation, then why does the universe need an explanation?
And that's a very good point. But as I've said all along, we can't talk about why God might exist. We can only address whether or not God actually exists in factual reality. And that's really the crux of the problem. Does God exist? Well, so far as we can tell, using logic, reason, and credible scientific principles, there's no reason whatsoever to think that God actually does. This is exactly why apologists try to give God a get-out-of-reality free card by differentiating between things we can evaluate and things we cannot.
To address this, Leibniz makes a key distinction between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It's impossible for them not to exist. Many mathematicians think that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist like this. They're not caused to exist by something else, they just exist by necessity of their own nature.
But these are just things that believers are defining into existence. How does one know that God must necessarily exist? How did you verify this in any rational way? Did you examine God to find out if he's a necessary entity? Or do you just have blind faith that he must be because you really want him to? Numbers are not real. They're conceptual. This is where believers try to blur the line between real and concept. Concepts only exist within the minds of intelligent agents. If there was no intelligent life anywhere in the universe, then numbers wouldn't exist either because there would be no one to conceptualize them. So, if that's what Christians want to make their God, by all means go ahead. But they have to realize that concepts can't actually do anything on their own. They can't create anything, they can't issue commands, and they certainly can't hold anyone accountable for their actions. And I guess that just makes God an impotent mess.
Things that exist contingently are caused to exist by something else. Most of the things we're familiar with exist contingently. They don't have to exist. They only exist because something else caused them to exist. If your parents had never met, you wouldn't exist. There's no reason to think the world around us had to exist. If the universe had developed differently, there might have been no stars or planets. It's logically possible that the whole universe might not have existed. It doesn't exist necessarily, it exists contingently.
We have no evidence of anything that actually exists in reality that wasn't quote-unquote caused by something else to exist. Of course, using the word cause is problematic because it implies purpose, it implies intent, which is exactly what our apologist is trying to do. And of course, nothing has to exist. Before the universe existed, the universe didn't exist by definition. But before the first intelligent mind thought up the concept of numbers, numbers didn't exist either. So we can throw that one right out the window. In fact, if you think about it, concepts cannot possibly exist without the existence of an intelligent mind, hence concepts are even less necessary than anything else. But clearly, apologists aren't interested in reality, they just want to perpetuate their own religious fantasies.
If the universe might not have existed, why does it exist?
And why is still not a worthwhile question to ask. We can examine how it exists. We can look at the mechanisms that brought it into existence. We can explore the facts surrounding its existence, but why? That's a pointless exercise in navel noodling.
The only adequate explanation for the existence of a contingent universe is that its existence rests on a non-contingent being, something that cannot not exist because of the necessity of its own nature. It would exist no matter what. So, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause.
And that throws logic straight out the window. Even if you're going to play this contingent non-contingent game, now he's asserting that the non-contingent thing must be a being. Where did that come from? Well, he pulled it straight out of his ass, of course. But then we get back to his original premises, which he's now going to change to reflect his logically impaired beliefs. Let's see how that goes.
But what about our second premise? Is it reasonable to call the explanation of the universe God?
Well, if God is just a label, you can call it anything you want. You can call it Fred for all I care, so long as you can prove that whatever said label describes actually exists, which we all know they can't.
Well, what is the universe? It's all of space-time reality, including all matter and energy. It follows that if the universe has a cause of its existence, that cause cannot be part of the universe. It must be non-physical and immaterial, beyond space and time.
It means nothing of the sort. But of course, our apologist doesn't know what the universe is. It is likely, at least mathematically, that we're part of a multiverse, a near infinite number of different universes existing alongside each other. Now, of course, we can't prove this at the moment, but it's certainly a better explanation based on mathematics than any God concept, which is based on nothing but wishful thinking. But I'm certainly not going to hold him to one set of standards and myself to another. Nobody can demonstrate their particular position, and thus, both positions must be logically jettisoned until one or the other of them can be proven. So, what does that leave us with? Well, it means we don't know. Not knowing is a perfectly adequate position to have. It means we keep looking. It means we don't make unsupported claims. It means we don't believe things for which there is no evidence. And I find that perfectly acceptable.
The list of entities that could possibly fit this description is fairly short.
No, but it is impossibly long. There are thousands of gods that man has invented for himself to worship over the years, any of which can be arbitrarily defined as non-contingent. Add to that the literally infinite list of possible gods that we could make up, and the candidates are endless. But of course, he doesn't want to acknowledge that, does he? And who says abstract objects can't cause anything? How does he know that God can? Again, it's an empty claim made without a shred of evidence for an entity that cannot be shown to exist in the first place. And somehow, he thinks this is impressive.
And abstract objects cannot cause anything. Leibniz's contingency argument shows that the explanation for the existence of the universe can be found only in the existence of God. Or, if you prefer not to use the term God, you may simply call him the extremely powerful, uncaused, necessarily existing, non-contingent, non-physical, immaterial, eternal being who created the entire universe and everything in it.
All of which is pulled straight out of his religious backside, unsupported by a shred of evidence, and laughable in the mind of anyone who's ever heard of logic, reason, or critical thinking. That's the problem with these apologetics videos. It's so absurdly easy to poke holes in their claims once you step away from the pre-existing belief that everything they say is necessarily true. Once you get rid of the blind faith in their particular God, it all falls apart like a house of cards in an earthquake. None of these claims are defensible. They all require that the adherent believe that the claims are true in order to decide that the claims are true, and that's logically circular. It shouldn't take a genius to figure out how problematic this is. It seems that the more of these apologetics videos that I look at, the more I find the same kind of logical fallacies and horrible rational shortcomings. Logic dictates that we start with the evidence, and only the evidence, and follow it, piece by piece, to a conclusion. The religious, however, they start with a conclusion, and then they carefully construct a narrative, picking and choosing which pieces of evidence that they want to look at so that it leads back to the conclusion that they already believe. This is not logical. This is not rational. This is blind faith in action. They aren't interested in looking for the truth because they're already supremely convinced that they've found it, and no amount of contradictory evidence, no amount of logical evaluation will ever convince them otherwise. That's why apologetics is so laughable. Thanks a lot for watching. I'd love to know your thoughts. Post your comments below and let's have a discussion. Of course, if you have other videos you'd like me to take on, you can post those too. I'll be back in another week with another video, and hopefully I can get back on my twice weekly schedule very soon. So I'm going to need more material. Hint, hint. Hope everyone has a great new year, and I'll see you all again next week.